So, David, you worked on bioterrorism. What are the challenges we face? I mean, you did mention something about just 3 days after 9/11. But what are the challenges we face and are we prepared?
Well, I think what we're facing really is the end of the day, unlike, say, cybersecurity, where something goes wrong, you power down the servers, you scrap the hardware, you do something new. I mean, and even with artificial intelligence, I know like recently, like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg were debating whether or not AI was the most existential threat to humanity. And I would say no. Even if an AI goes rogue, you either pull out the power or you do an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, and that will take it out and you're okay.
Mm.
Bio, on the other hand, if something goes wrong, you can't really reboot the planet.
Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a vodcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to our channel, please consider subscribing to it and hit the bell icon so that you can never miss an update. Our episodes go live 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time every day. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I am privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished individual from the US, Dr. David Bray. David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Ashutosh. It's really great to be here with you.
Thank you. David is the founder director of the Atlantic Council. He's a digital diplomat and a human flak jacket. He's been named 24 amongst the 24 Americans who are going to change the world. He's passionate about the future of work, future of governance, and future of augmented communities. He's the speaker at Singularity, Harvard, and Oxford. And interestingly, he has been recognized as a young global leader from the World Economic Forum, which is something I happened to me as well, but that was in 1994. So I'm an old GLT, as they were called. So, David, let's talk about the Atlantic Council. Tell me about what you do at the Atlantic Council.
Sure. So the center that I helped found, it was the inaugural center that we stood up, is what's called the Geotech Center, which is focusing on how data and technologies changing geopolitics, changing global collaborations, but also global competition. And this is really a conversation that's only possible now because, as I tell people, the good news is technology has been democratized. That means you can do things that were only possible to, say, the United States and the USSR back in the 80s. You can do things with a smartphone that only the CIA and the KGB could do 30 years ago. But the challenging news is technology is being democratized as well. And so we're really interested in how does that change, how do nation states interact? How do companies interact across the world? And what do people do in this changing world? And the Atlantic Council itself, we've been around since 1961, and it really is about the idea that we're stronger together with allies across sectors and borders.
Amazing. So, I'm going to ask you a question which has probably got a huge, long answer. But tell me, what are some of the significant shifts you are beginning to see in the 21st century? And we'll leave COVID aside.
Right, leave COVID aside. If anything, COVID just basically accelerated us 5 or 6 years future. But the trends were already there, which was, we're putting forward that if you look at the 2001 to 2011 time period, which included the US and the world as a whole dealing with counterterrorism. If you remember in the 1990s, there were several that were proclaiming that we saw the end of history, that supposedly we had seen with the Cold War and with the Berlin Wall falling, that capitalism plus a free liberal society was the dominant way to organize. And then unfortunately, the events of 9/11 happened and other events occurred, 7/7 in London and things like that showed that maybe that wasn't the case. I personally was actually involved with what was called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. This was at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. We were initially only 30 people created in 2000 to deal with if a bioterrorism event happened. 30 people out of a 15,000 person organization for a country of more than 330 million people. And it was actually scheduled weeks in advance for me to give a briefing to the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do technology-wise should a bad day happen, should a bioterrorism event happen. And that briefing just happened to be scheduled for September 11th, 2001, 9 o'clock in the morning. So clearly didn't get to give that briefing because 8:34, the world changed. We dealt with the response to both New York and DC and stood down from high alert on October 1st. I ended up giving that briefing to the CIA on October 3rd, only to have the first case of anthrax show up 24 hours later. So it was a very busy time. Later dealt with the response to severe acute respiratory syndrome in 2003, monkeypox. There were other outbreaks that happened both domestically and internationally. And then in 2005, went to go get a PhD. If we then now look at 2011 to 2021, I would call that, unfortunately, the decade of disillusionment, in which we're coming in the aftermath of responding to the last decade with counterterrorism. Right. Now we're in 2011, and if you remember, in the United States, we had a new president that was bringing a message of hope. There was hope that we were going to see some reinvigoration and things such as that. There was also the message of hope when it came to businesses. And if you think about, big tech was seen as it was going to be a way that we were going to be brought into the future. Fast forward to 2020, at the end of that decade, there wasn't a lot of hope left. And if anything, big tech now, people are skeptical about, has it caused misinformation, disinformation, or is it contributing to it? Is it polarizing people in open societies? Hope in the United States, if anything, we're a more polarized electorate than ever in some respects. And so this was a decade in which there was a lot of hope, both in government, but also in big tech and big companies. And we ended the decade with some frustrations. So what are the trends we're now facing if we're looking forward? First, it really is the idea that you can do things that were only possible to nation states or individuals. That includes, for example, I'm seeing apps that right now allow you to pull up a photo of anywhere on the planet at a very high resolution with less than 15 minutes notice. In fact, I'm seeing within the next year or two, you'll be able to get 25 centimeter resolution satellite imageries of anywhere on the planet in almost real time. Wow. I mean, that's a massive. I mean, I feel like I have to pinch myself because I'm like, is that classified? No, it's commercially available. And you can now do things with supply chains and things like that. And so that space technology is transformative, and it's going to raise interesting questions, which is, how do we want to use it for good? How do we want to make sure it doesn't invade privacy? And what happens if 8 or 9 years from now, let's say there's a divorce case going on, and one of the aggrieved spouses pulls up satellite records saying, you said you went to the supermarket, but really I can show where you went. Do we want that? I'm not sure. And so we got to ask these questions. But that's just one example. Another example is what's possible with machine learning. I mean, the good news is you can do things at massive scale if you have access to the data. But as we know, there's still challenges in open societies about making that data available. And one of the things we're really focusing at the Geotech Center is, how can you do data with people, whether that's through what's called data co-ops or data trust, where people are involved, they're actually involved in a process and understanding what's being done with the data, as opposed to just hoovering it up and people feeling like they've lost a locus of control. And then finally, bio. I mean, yes, obviously the pandemic happened, but putting that aside, the interesting story that has not really been shared too broadly is most of the vaccines were both designed in a computer and then printed nucleotide by nucleotide. I mean, literally like designed in silica and then engineered by nucleotide to actually make the mRNA vaccine. That's fascinating. I mean, this points to the decade of personal medicine. But we should realize that personalized medicine can also be personalized poison. And if you're not careful, how are we going to deal with when people use this for less than benign or less than benevolent purposes? How are we going to make sure people don't abuse this? And who's going to respond? Is that law enforcement? Is that police officers? Is that doctors? And these are all things that we're going to have to answer in the next 10 years if we're going to navigate the future together successfully.
Absolutely fascinating. So tell me, from a common human being's perspective, how are these 4 segments you spoke about, how will they impact my life as a common man?
Well, I think it's going to overload you with what might be called future shock. I mean, there was a book that was already written well then that you're just going to feel like, massive amounts of change. And instead of happening in series, I mean, I tell people, think about everything that happened in the last 2-3 decades with the internet, and now compress that into just 9 or 10 years. We're going to see that same amount of change, but not just once, but in parallel, in bio, in the area of cyber, in the area of space, all in parallel within the same decade. It's going to strain CEOs. It's going to strain private companies trying to deal with this. It's going to strain governments. How do they deal with it? And I think you're going to see some people, out of frustration, out of feeling like things are changing too fast or they're not included, possibly becoming more extreme. And you're going to have a rise of possibly extremists if we're not careful, people who are anti-tech because they're worried about it's going too fast. And if you're not careful as well, we know from the past, look at railroads, look at what happened in the industrial age. Any technology revolution initially has a disproportionate number of people that are left behind and a few people that are sort of like the railroad tycoons or the barons. And it's sort of disproportionate distribution of the benefits of the new technology. Well, if this is happening all at once and in parallel on multiple sides,
Mhm.
if we're not careful, we may see a rise of a lot of what I will call neo-feudalist serfs
Mhm.
that are not empowered to be a part of the uplift that's occurring, and then a very few that are benefiting. And that may cause disruption, revolutions, or other types of frustrations to occur.
Very
So
true.
it's not just navigating the geopolitics, it's not just navigating the thorny issues of how do you interact between the public sector and the private sector. It is ultimately about equity and making sure you try to rise the boats for everybody and let everyone have a role to play as innovators in this space, as opposed to just a few.
Very interesting. And do you see technology being able to bridge the gap between the rich countries and the poor countries, or do you think the gap is going to get wider?
Well, that's a good question, because I think it's for poor countries right now, there's the opportunity to leapfrog the legacy burdens and investments that have been put in place by some of the existing established players. You think about it, like, why try to do landline communications when you can go straight to mobile? And we've seen that already play itself out in several African countries, for example. Same thing with space. If we think about this huge technology to now actually make sense of things from space, you can identify soil conditions, you can identify soil acidity. The challenge, though, is I think it's not so much the technology, is can you organize to deal with this the best? And what do I mean by that? Well, we know that there's going to be large farmers and small farmers everywhere in the world. But will small farmers be at a disadvantage because they won't be able to bring together their data to make sense of how do I make my crops more productive, more resilient to climate change and things like that? Is that something that only the big farmers can do? And if so, then you're going to have, again, a case where people are left behind, whether it's countries or whether it's companies, et cetera. So I think we need to think about how do you actually make it so that underdogs can also play a role in this tech? And I think that's going to be a key question, because I think if we don't figure out a way to bring along everybody, if it does become a very disproportionate haves versus have-nots, then there's going to be a whole lot of frustrations. And usually when human beings aren't frustrated, we get violent. And I hope that doesn't happen. But I also try to share with people, we're not the only species that's like this. There's a wonderful, interesting story about, so for example, chimpanzees. Chimpanzees prefer bananas over cucumbers, but they'll eat cucumbers, as long as they don't see that another chimpanzee in visual range is getting a banana. The moment they see that another chimpanzee is getting a banana and they're not, they'll stop eating the cucumbers, they'll throw them at the researchers, and they'll actually go on a hunger strike, which is completely, it's not rational, because you'd rather have something than nothing. But we humans have developed this innate sense of, there is a sense of fairness, and we'll actually reject things that we think are unfair, trying to get something that we think is fair. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind as we go to a planet that's now about 7.9 billion people, and by the end of the decade could easily be 9 billion people or more.
I agree. Well said. So, you describe yourself as a digital diplomat and a human flak jacket. Help me understand this, maybe with an anecdote or an example.
Sure. So I first will give you my philosophy of leadership, which is, some say that leadership comes from there was a Greek phrase, lead, which means to be sent unto death. And you're like, well, what does leadership have to be about being sent unto death? Well, it's partly because back in ancient Greece, the elites were the ones that carried the flag in front of the army. And it's all well and good until one ground army meets another ground army, and the first to die are the flag bearers, the elites. But as a leader, it's a question of helping an organization let go or die in terms of things that are legacy ways of thinking, legacy ways of operating. For example, I parachuted once in 2014. This was an organization, it was called the Federal Communications Commission, where they had 8 CIOs, give or take, some in acting capacities, about 8 CIOs in 9 years, which is, I always say, is a great sign that things are going great with that amount of turnover. And my diagnosis, as I listened to people to try and figure out what's going on, it's that everybody knew they had to change, but anyone who brought that message of change risked becoming the target of the organization and was sort of like kicked out, as opposed to trying to make it so that everybody recognized we had to change. One of the examples, for example, at that organization, they were spending more than 85% of their budget on more than 207 different IT systems, more than half of which were more than 10 years old. And so what we ultimately needed to do was to move to private hosting in the cloud, which for government at the time was seen as very risky. In fact, the sad thing is only 11% of US government agencies have still gone to the cloud since then. But in less than 2.5 years, we did move everything to the cloud. And you might say, well, how did we do that? Especially when I had that amount of turnover before I arrived. Well, the way we did it was I asked questions. I asked the team, I said, where do we want to go? What do we think is working and what do we think is not working? Now, I had a theory of the case, But my approach to doing Socratic questioning was an idea of, let's try to bring along as many people as we can. So it's not just me identifying that we have a challenge here and we have to actually solve it, but it's the team. And that worked. And to credit, I mean, the people that had sort of had that change fatigue before I arrived mobilized and made it happen. But I'll give you another example that's from that same organization, which is, oftentimes we say, don't shoot the messenger. And because we do. The reality is, and that sometimes the most valuable thing a leader can do is point out the things that nobody else is seeing, whether the emperor has no clothes, for example, or something's happening that they're not willing to admit. But that's where you have to be willing to don that flak jacket. Yes, you need to be a diplomat. Yes, you need to be able to ask questions and try to bring people along. But be careful, because sometimes when you expose an inconvenient truth, they might just shoot the messenger. And I raise that because I think that's key to anyone that wants to be a leader, is you have to decide with your own principles, what amount of friction are you willing to accept? And sometimes the best thing you can do, you may not be spotted for maybe a few more years afterwards that people come back and say, that was one of the best things that happened. But at the time, we were very resistant to what you were doing. In fact, I heard that later at the Federal Communications Commission. People came back later and said, you were right. We were resisting at the time, but later we saw that it was actually a really good thing.
And this would apply to political leaders of countries as well, I'm sure.
Oh, well, if anything,
because they shoot the messenger all the time.
It's very convenient for political individuals, and sometimes also have a false political messenger to shoot, because but I think at the end of the day, while I get frustrated, because again, I've never been political, I probably never will be a political appointee, because unfortunately I speak my mind, and that doesn't usually end well. But I raise that because yes, we, the electorate, get the politician we deserve, which is if we elect a politician that gives us black and white answers that oversimplifies things and it creates an us versus them narrative or a shoot the messenger narrative, then we, the electorate, deserve that because we elected that, because we shaped their behaviors. But if instead we actually encourage political leaders that are much more, it's about, look, it's challenging narratives, but we can find ways to actually find common ground. If we have someone that we even accuse, how often in the United States have we heard the narrative, that's a flip-flopper? Well, it's like, no, that's actually a good thing. I want a politician that reconsiders their position and is learning. And so this is an interesting question for the decade as well that we're tackling with the Geotech Center, which is, can democracies like India, like the United States, like those in Europe, can they move at the speed necessary to deal with all these technological changes? Okay. Or will their politicians be so caught up in the theater of politics and virtue signaling that more autocratic nations that don't care about what their public thinks, and unfortunately either imprison people or worse if they disagree with them, will the autocratic nations be able to move ahead simply because they're not trying to actually involve people in the process? And I hope that's not the case, because clearly I'm for open societies around the world. But I think this is going to be a really deep question that we'll have to figure out. And my hope is this: while I don't expect politicians to change, because again, we, the electorate, we pressure them in some respects to behave black and white as opposed to saying it's shades of gray and it's complicated. But maybe business leaders will recognize that if the instability that will occur as a result of increasing polarization, misinformation, disinformation, and the like happens, then they'll lose their business marketplaces. Maybe business leaders can be a martyring force that says, look, I know you've got to do what's necessary to do to score political points, but we also need to actually focus on how does this actually uplift people and get down to serious business. And so maybe that's the way we navigate the next 10 years ahead.
Fascinating. So, David, you worked on bioterrorism. What are the challenges we face? I mean, you did mention something just 3 days after 9/11. But what are the challenges we face, and are we prepared?
Well, I think what we're facing really is, at the end of the day, unlike, say, cybersecurity, where something goes wrong, you power down the servers, you scrap the hardware, you do something new. I mean, and even with artificial intelligence, I know like recently, like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg were debating whether or not AI was the most existential threat to humanity. And I would say no. Even if an AI goes rogue, you either pull out the power or you do an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, and that will take it out and you're okay. Bio, on the other hand, if something goes wrong, you can't really reboot the planet. And I think that's really what we're facing here. This is one of those things that just one slip up, really bad things could happen. I mean, obviously the pandemic has illustrated, and that was naturally caused. And so one of the things that I've been trying to push forward, and I continue to push forward, is we need to create the equivalent of what I call a global pandemic alert system. And it's not just looking for signs of new pathogens, although that's part. But if we go back to 2002, one of the ways that we in the bioterrorism program knew about severe acute respiratory syndrome about 5.5 months before China said anything, we knew about it for two reasons. One, the price of garlic had gone up tenfold, because garlic is seen as a cure-all. And so if you see the price of garlic all of a sudden spike, that's a sign that people are looking for something to help treat some unknown illness or something like that. But the other reason we knew, and at the time we couldn't say too publicly, was satellite footages. There were less people going to certain factories, there were more people going to hospitals or things like that. And so a change in life. So we weren't targeting any one person, but we're just saying there's less cars here, there's more cars over here, something odd is happening. And sure enough, you look at what happened with COVID-19, price of garlic went up, surprise. And similarly, also with COVID-19, commercial satellite footages now showed that there were less people going to factories and more people going to hospitals. Wow. And so the question is, could we make this open source so it's available to everybody on the planet in real time that just says, look, we're not targeting individuals, we're just looking for changes in the patterns of life on the planet, changes in economic signals that say maybe there's a rush on the market for something. And that could serve as early warnings, not just for pandemics, but if there's shocks to climate change, if there's other things going on, and make it available not just to governments, but make it available to companies and individuals. Because I think what we're seeing right now is if any one government has a really bad day happen, they have, unfortunately, a perverse incentive to keep it quiet, which actually impacts us all. And if instead we make it so this is available to everybody, then you're actually making it more of like a smoke detector that's gone off and says there's a fire in the building, we've got to respond to it as quickly as possible. Because I believe the faster you can respond to these things, the earlier you can do to actually figure out a solution that actually helps everybody on the planet, as opposed to losing valuable time.
And what you said is very so true. I mean, if this becomes open source, we've got enough talent across the whole planet to be able to monitor a lot of these things.
100%.
But what is fascinating for me is that we can actually predict a lot of these if you start to see movement of cars and everything that you've said. So that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and when you think about it, we'll need this anyway for climate change, because we know there's going to be disruptions to climate change. For example, at the same time that COVID-19 was playing itself out in 2020, most people may or may not know, there were locusts in Africa, for example. There was also fires in Australia. And so those were clearly not the pandemic, but they were impacting us. And so if you create this equivalent of smoke detectors around the planet, that basically, again, it's not, people, I want to respect privacy. I don't want to be at the individual level. I want to be at the aggregate level that says something's going on here that will impact us all, make it open source. And then you actually, in some respects, just like how technology is democratizing what people can do, this open source approach can democratize who responds. So it could be businesses that respond and say, we can help out here. It could be NGOs that respond. You don't have to wait till the government says something's going on over here. Anybody and everybody could play a role. And I think that's how we actually navigate this future together. And it may point to new ways of governing that don't always involve governments.
Amazing. I'm actually now faced with a little dilemma. I mean, we're running out of time, but I have such a huge section to talk to you on future of work, future of governance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to request you maybe for a second one only on future of work, future of governance, and future of augmented communities. And I'm going to come to my last question for this recording and then fix another date for the next one. When I was reading about you, you spoke about a near impossible mission. Tell me about that.
Well, so I'm one of those people that if it's been done before, I'm just not excited. And maybe that's just my personality. I don't know. I get motivated when someone says, it's not possible, or we've tried it multiple times. I mean, again, like this, the situation I pointed out where there'd been like 9 people had tried in 8 years, didn't work out. There was another case, for example, where I was asked to serve on a commission that was going to review the research and development efforts of the entire U.S. intelligence community.
Wow.
And there had been four people prior to me that had been in the role for about a month each, and for various reasons. Either they didn't get along with the co-chairs, or they didn't do a good job communicating, whatever. I was now new in the seat after there had been that many people. And the good news is, a year and a half later, no one else got killed, physically or metaphorically, and released a report that had bipartisan praise in 2013, which even in 2013, bipartisan praise in the United States was hard to come by. And I raise that because it's a thorny sort of human plus technology, but even more, it's just sort of like figuring out the theory of the case that actually moves us forward. And so I like it when people say, do you want to deal with this messy hairball problem that involves understanding tech, but also understands involving people? And I think I get that from my parents, and I have to give credit to them. My dad was a Methodist minister, so he was about healing fragmented congregations and capital planning. And my mom was a school teacher. And I realize here I am now, I've become them. But to me, when someone says it's not possible because of human reasons or technology reasons, or whatever, I'm like, sign me up, because that's what motivates me to tackle it.
Amazing. So as you would say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
No, and also the patterns and behaviors that parents display, you realize inevitably you've become them.
I agree with you. David, much as I'd like to keep talking, I mean, I have to stop now. I can just say, wow, I mean, such an amazing conversation with you. I've learned so many new things from you, and I'm sure the thousands of people who will listen to us and to everything that you've said will really, really learn a lot of things that you've said. I'm grateful you took the time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for everything you're doing, and I look forward to further conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.